right. That was kind of weird. So we're trying some new things. You saw the new Splash starting soon screen, which is pretty cool. And that worked fine. And then something happened to my Splash intro videos, and that totally did not work. So I'm going to have to go back and check that out. But also next time I have to run the starting soon screen for a little bit longer because it's pretty cool and I want to hear like the music. But yeah, so welcome everybody to Canhammer TV, your source for 40K from the Great White North. I hope the sound is okay. Didn't ask for a sound check, but let me know if the sound is not working well. And shout out to Matt Williamson, who is our kind of graphic designer and helps us make all our graphics and everything. And he made that cool little screen. I saw it's kind of a thing right now for everyone to have these cool starting soon screens, and ours was pretty crappy. So I decided to get Matt to make us something, and that looks pretty cool. So I'm happy with that. It kind of goes with our logo Splash too, which is like ice and cold and you know, and that all fits with the weather we had today because we woke up today and it's end of April and there was snow. And luckily it's all gone now and we can be done with winter for sure. And funny thing, you know, it's lockdown and the schools are closed. So otherwise I would have had to get all my daughter's winter clothes out again, which is really annoying, but we didn't have to do that. So welcome everybody to episode 54 of Custodes Tactica. This will be our last unit deep dive. We have made it to the end. I don't know how many that is in total, but yeah, it's been a fun series, really going deep on every single unit that we have. And we'll probably have to do it again once we get our book, but it's always fun to do that. And for a short time at least, all of these deep dives will be perfectly applicable to your everyday games. So enjoy it while you can until everything gets outdated again. And so tonight's deep dive, it'll be on the last two units to cover, which are the two flyers. And so the Orion and the Ares. And so we'll be covering those tonight on our deep dive. Before we start, a bit of a hobby update. So I've continued to slowly paint through my those Dark Deathwing Knights. They're slowly coming along. I'm very excited. It was supposed to be tomorrow, but I had to cancel. It's going to be in a couple of weeks when I'm going on put paint on it with Scary. And we will be starting on my Uncle Number 4 bust live on his stream. So I'm excited for that. And I've also started to prime at least the Cursed City models, which are awesome. So I got a box of the Cursed City, the new Cursed City game. And I gotta say, these models may be the best models GW has ever made. Not only in terms of how cool they go together. Actually, the Inquisitor guy, Jelson, I think that's his name, Jelson. He was actually quite tricky to put together because he has like 3 or 4 overlapping layers, and like the gun crosses under the sword, and it's pretty complicated, but it was cool. So he is by far my favorite model because he could be Inquisitor, but he just looks super cool. And then there's also this guy, whatever his name is, with the gun and like the cutlass hanging across the back, and he's got like the arm of his jacket there that's hanging off his shoulder, just swinging out as he walks. The cool ass model that could also be like an Inquisitor, but super cool model. And Jelson as well, my two favorite models. And the other character models are just amazing as well. And even like the chaff zombies and the corpse rats and stuff, they're all awesome. So even if you're not going to play the game, which I played one game now with my daughter, who's only 6, and it was fun. It was pretty easy, but it was fun. And it's kind of like Warhammer AOS Light. It's kind of like a mix. It's like Gloomhaven. If you've ever played the legacy game Gloomhaven, a board game, it's like Gloomhaven but with dice and a little bit less heavy. So it's pretty fun, but man, there's like 50 models in there and they're all beautiful. So I highly recommend you get just for the models. All right, so been working on these guys. Okay. So, lockdown still in effect, so no games returning for now. We are getting the vaccinations out there finally, so hopefully soon, in the next few weeks, we can end this lockdown and bring back the games. So, okay, well, let's get started on our deep dive. All right, so tonight we're going to cover the two flyers. The two flyers are interesting units. At first, it was just the Orion. So the Orion was the first big flyer to come out, and it was a Lord of War back then in 8th. And of course, you could bring 3 Lord of Wars back then, and some people did. And really, the Orion had its 15 minutes of fame, I think, at the Nova Invitational, like 2 or 3 years back, still in 8th edition, when I think somebody won or did very well at the Nova Invitational with 3 Orions. And anyway, after that, it got nerfed and became very inefficient to run, and then it never really regained its limelight. And then the Ares came along, and it has more recently had its time to shine, and maybe just in single Ares, but we have seen some lists with 2, and I've seen a few lists with 3 Ares. But by and large, we've not seen a lot of these flyers, mostly because of points cost and because of money cost. And, I'm not doubting my fellow Custodes players who happen to have 3 of these big flyers, but that is $1,500 of Forge World resin. I can't assume that everybody is buying their resin illegally. So that's a lot of money for 3 models. Anyway, so are they really worth it is the question. Worth it? And do we need them in our army? And so we're going to try and figure that out tonight. Now, here's a thought to keep in your head as we go through this. Do we want these models to be good? Do we want the Ares to be really good or the Orion to be really good? Like, sure, I know everybody wants all our units to be good, but do we want a large, polarizing model that takes up a quarter of your army to be so good that is super expensive as well to buy, so that it's kind of like a must-have, or that a competitive list must have one in? Do we want that in our army? I don't think we do, actually. I don't want people to feel like they have to have an Orion or an Ares to compete. I don't want people to feel like they have to spend $500 on a single model or else get it somewhere else to compete. I don't think that's good for our faction or good for the game. So I don't actually feel bad that not a lot of people either own these or play them. And sure, you playing a casual game or some beer hammer in your basement or outside in the summertime, I can't wait to actually field my Ares one of those times. But I don't feel like we want these to be super good. Okay, so for the purposes, big disclaimer, for the purposes of this deep dive, I am assuming that they are allowed to deploy and act turn 1. Now, there's big controversy still. I won't call it controversy, but there's still, let's say, TOs or people out there who rule against the Ares being able to act turn 1. They are now officially allowed to deploy, yes, but the argument still is that they still overhang, and so they still don't fit in smallest dimension inside the deployment zone, and so can't act. The counter argument being that you don't normally count if your model's hand sticks into a rune, that it counts in the rune if the base is outside the rune. So why do we count this for this? I don't know, whatever. So I'm not getting into that debate tonight. I personally think it's fine, but whatever. We're going to assume that it's fine and not include that in our deep dive. All right. But final thing on that. If you are intending to take your Ares or Orion to a tournament near you, please check with your TO what they think they are going to rule, and then you'll be safe. Okay? All right. Okay. So the first part of the deep dive is always modeling. Okay. Okay, first thing to say about these models is they are big. Okay, this thing is big. All right, it is big. I mean, that's my head. It is big. And this is $450 Canadian. So that's 10 freedom dollars for you Americans out there, and a bajillion Australian dollars. But this is $450, which is a lot of money. Aside from Titans, these are probably some of the most expensive Forge World models you can buy. And they are big chunks of resin in a big box. So, that's generally the price you pay for big models, Thunderhawks, stuff like that, Mastodons. And it's actually $100 more for the Orion, because the Orion is bigger and more solid. I didn't even take it down from the shelf. There it is. So it is even bigger than the Ares. And so watch out. It's expensive. And it's actually quite ridiculous money if you think about it, considering you can buy a whole Custodes army for almost the same price. So definitely cool factor, yes. You might never play it, but cool. Okay, so they are very well made. Nice models, newer generation Forge World stuff, and very nice. Now, I would not suggest you tackle one of these unless you're pretty experienced in dealing with Forge World, number one, and big model Forge World. Because the big models never go together perfectly. They always require sanding and fitting, lots of dry fitting and lots of gap filling. And they always require some degree of something other than super glue. Pinning, epoxy, a combination of both. So this is pinned and epoxied. It will never come apart unless I smash it, but it is a lot of work. So the Orion is pretty straightforward because it's just a giant chunk in the middle, 2 or 3 pieces that go together, and then you stick the wings, and there's a lot to bind onto. The Ares is a lot trickier, and I'll just take it off the base here for a second. So basically, the Ares comes with this front part, and then it comes with this kind of U-shaped bit, which doesn't really have a lot of thickness to it. And then you have to put the wings into the thickness. The wings, this part of the wings themselves is a separate piece. It's small and it's not that heavy. But these nacelles, and then you put the engines and the wings, these are quite heavy. And so they really need to kind of almost go through that wing bit. And then there's not a lot of purchase here because this is cut out for the engine bit here. So it's actually quite a tricky, large, heavy model to assemble. And it's certainly a lot harder to assemble than the Orion. But it's super cool. It kind of reminds me of various other franchises, unintentionally, I'm sure. And then the other thing to say is it does come with a base. I've put it on this kind of big base like that, which I think is the standard one it comes with. It's not the normal flyer base. But it also comes with this little mini flying stand, so that you can model it in hover mode. So it is officially allowed to be modeled in hover mode, which I feel like that's probably just going to cause you problems if you do that at a tournament. So just put it on a normal flying stand. Okay, save yourself the aggravation. But in a cool Crusade game or something, you could certainly say, okay, it's going into hover and change the base. That would be cool. So yeah. Otherwise, it's not got a lot of parts and it's fairly easy to put together, but it's that initial thing that you really need to have experience dealing with large Forge World models. And then, of course, you have to wash the whole thing very well, and then it takes a ton of paint to spray on. So I think I used my whole bottle of like Dwarven Gold to spray that thing. So yeah, so it takes time, and it's a labor of love for sure. Okay. So let's move on. Role and keywords. Okay, so these guys are flyers. And the likelihood that you're going to use more than one is small. Of course, you can still take 3 flyers because you can take 2 per detachment. So you have to run 2 detachments, or you have to run a detachment and an auxiliary. Not sure why you would ever do that. So, you're probably just taking 1 in your detachment. Obviously, if they were still Lords of War, that would be bad. We would basically have to pay 3 CP to use one, and so that wouldn't even be usable. So definitely the change to being flyers instead of Lords of War definitely makes sense in order to make them usable. And okay, the next keyword is aircraft. Okay, so being aircraft has its pros and cons. The only real cool thing about being aircraft is that they can go into reserve if you can't make the minimum move. I don't think I guess you could also fly it off on purpose to save it. Say if it's almost dead turn 2, then at least it can come back on turn 4 and do some stuff. And maybe by turn 4, all the anti-vehicle stuff is gone. So the flexibility of being able to disappear it for a turn, and definitely the flexibility not crash and burn, is probably useful. And then when it comes back in, it can be 9 inches from any enemy. So that's nice and flexible. The downside is, of course, that you can't do anything with it in terms of holding objectives. Now, you can still block objectives. That base is big enough to block an objective. So even though you're not holding it, you stop your opponent from holding it, which is a strategic thing to do with it, and certainly big enough to move block. But it can still get you engage and these kind of zone requirements that just require a unit, but specifically they can't hold objectives. And they can't do that in hover either. So, it does lose that by being aircraft. Now they're fly, of course, and the Orion is a transport, which we'll talk about in a bit. And that's about it, really, from keywords and roles. Okay, stats. So they're both the same. They both move 20 inches minimum move up to 50 inches, degrading down to 30 inches, and they can both hover. So in terms of movement, they can certainly cover a lot of space, of distance, certainly enough of the board in today's game that it's not a big deal. They don't move 70. And they have the typical kind of one pivot of 90 degrees. So they're not like jammy Eldar flyers. They are still limited to those kind of movements, but it's not really a big deal. And they're both weapon skill 6, like standard vehicles, and they're both ballistic skill 2, like the rest of our army. So that's good. And ballistic skill is one of the things that degrades down to a 4+, which sucks, obviously. Now, they're both strength and T8. Strength doesn't really matter, but T8, 22 wounds. So that is pretty beefy. That's only 2 wounds short of a knight. So that's pretty beefy. And T8, obviously vital for using Shadow Keepers to keep these guys alive. So they're pretty hardy. Not as probably around the same amount of toughness as a Telemon. Depending on what's shooting at it. The Telemon, of course, has a 4-up invuln. These only have a 5-up invuln. And Telemon is 2-up save. These only have 3-up save. So, but it has kind of 8 extra wounds. Probably they're about the same. Maybe the Telemon is a bit tougher, especially if you're good at rolling 4-ups. And at the end of the day, there's still not a lot of vehicles with invulns on them. So having a vehicle with a 3-up, 5-up invuln is still pretty good. And of course, you can slap a 5-up Feel No Pain against mortal wounds. So these things do require some dedicated firepower to take down, which lots of armies have, but maybe they have less of it if you get to hit them first from far away with a flyer. I don't know. So they can be fairly tough to deal with, and certainly later in the game when all the firepower is gone, nobody's taking these things down. The only other degrading stat that they have is their number of melee attacks. Whatever. So their stats are basically their flying knights. They're basically knights that fly with a 5-up invuln, and they shoot better than knights at ballistic skill 2. So not too bad. Okay. So shooting. So the shooting is really where it's at for these guys. They hit on 2s. If you've got a captain nearby, they reroll 1s. How long you have a captain nearby for is probably 1 turn at the most, because they usually fly off and can't really keep up with them. They actually hit very accurately, which almost no other big model like that does. They're certainly the most accurate shooting big models. Knights usually hit on 3s. Guard super heavies I think hit on 3s, maybe 4s. And so they're just not as accurate with their weaponry. So the Orion has two heavy blaze cannons, which is basically the same as the Cladius heavy blaze cannons. Two shots, 48 inches, strength 9, -4, D3 plus 3 damage, rerolling wounds against vehicles. So that's your standard heavy blaze cannon. And so the Orion has two of those, and so puts out 4 shots, and then puts out 8 shots with the burst profile. So this gun is okay. As we talked about when we talked about the Cladius, I think it just suffers from too few shots, and it would be better if it was double the number of shots, and it would be way more consistent. The burst profile is, could be meatier. 1 damage is pretty shitty these days. D3 or even flat 2 would be better. And 1 damage just doesn't really cut it, and you're paying 500 points to shoot 1 damage shots at people. It just doesn't feel good. So it just needs more shots, really. And then now granted, the Orion is a transport, so it's not supposed to have a lot of weaponry, so you could say, okay, fine. But that just makes more of an argument to never take the Orion versus the Ares. Plus, it's more expensive. So, as we've talked about before, the Lastrum Bolt Cannon, unfortunately, at 6 AP2, 1 damage. Again, just lackluster with only 1 damage. It may be coming back in a little bit of efficacy these days with Drukhari and stuff to take out people. So you have one gun that takes out the transport and then another gun that shoots the dudes inside. But 1 damage generally is not that great these days. It would be nice if it had gone up to 2 damage. Let's move on to the Ares. So the Ares is supposed to be the gunship. Okay, so has more guns. So it has some more guns. It really has 1 more gun. So it also has the standard Cladius armament of the heavy blaze cannon. And then it has the only other gun it has is the Magna blaze cannon. So this is supposed to be the biggest of the big daddy blaze cannons. Okay, which is great, but unfortunately it does D3 shots. D3, there it is again. Everywhere we look is D3. And so you could pay 450 points to have 1 shot with your Magna Cannon. And I don't know, that just really sucks. At least 2 shots, 3 shots. Flat 3 shots would not be unreasonable for 450 points. And I mean, I feel like it really needs to be 2 or 3 shots min to make this worth 450 points. And I mean, yeah, you roll a 1 on that D3 and you're just crying, okay? Now, those shots are strong, right? Strength 14, -4, D3 plus 6. But you know what? Strength 14 isn't even that strong. You're still rolling to wound T8 on 3s. So that still kind of sucks. You roll your 1 shot, then you roll a 2 on your to wound, and guess what? This does not reroll against vehicles to wound like every other blaze weapon in our book. So for some reason, it's been left out either intentionally or accidentally and never fixed. So the biggest big daddy of the blaze weapons does not get reroll wounds against vehicles. Maybe they felt that wounding on 3s was good enough and you didn't need it, which is complete nonsense. So you roll your 1 shot, then you roll a 2, and you're just like, not good. Now, -4 obviously will crap on all vehicles that don't have invulns, and then you're going to do D3 plus 6 damage, which is average of 8 damage, which is good, but that still doesn't kill a rhino. So you could crap out on killing a rhino with this monster 450 point vehicle killing gunship, which sucks. I feel like you should be guaranteed to kill 1 vehicle plus or minus another 1, and it just doesn't do it. And then you could totally fail your 2 other blaze cannon shots. So it just doesn't feel good for 450 points. And generally it will kill your 1 vehicle, yes, but if you have to decide beforehand how to split your shots, then it's just it's just super not good. Now it is blast, but I can't think off the top of my head a lot of things you're going to be shooting into it where blast is going to make a difference, like robots or chicken walkers if they're running more than 5 GSC buggies. I don't even know if you can take them in units that are that large. And that just doesn't work out. And if you want to shoot this at a unit of like 6 Terminators, then go ahead. Not only are you only killing Terminators, but you're also suffering transhuman. So, and then wounding on 4s in this thing, it just feel really bad. So, yeah. The blast is like not a whoop-de-doo. Okay, and then the burst profile is okay, but again, it's just 3 shots. I mean, this thing should be way more shots on burst profile, like 4 shots, 5 shots, 6 shots. It's like, yeah, strength 9, -3, D3 damage. So again, it can really suck. And again, no rerolls versus vehicles. So I don't know. This big gun really just doesn't do it for me. Yeah, it doesn't have Lastrum or anything, like no other flexibility. So it's a vehicle hunter through and through, and it's like that thing's not even necessarily going to kill a Rhino. So yeah. So the Ares is shootier than the Orion, but not by much, and maybe different things. So yeah, I mean, you can guarantee 1 vehicle kill per turn. Pretty much, most of the time, unless you get really unlucky. But is that good enough? Maybe. It is one of the few things that we have that can shoot anywhere on the table, basically turn 1. And you cannot hide from it, really. Very difficult. So if that is something that we really need, it can give it to us. So, yeah. Bombs. So bombs is not one of its shooting weapons, but it's on the rules, but it kind of like shooting, so I'm going to talk about it here. So this is, the bombs have changed over time. So it used to be that you fly over something in the movement phase and you drop your bombs. Like that's how bombers usually work. And you could drop up to 20 bombs on a unit, and you roll a 4-up, and you could do a crap ton of mortal wounds. And so that was a great bomb. That was a great bomb for taking out units of stuff. And it wasn't particularly crazy, and you could only do that twice a game. Still, twice a game is pretty good. Usually bombs are just once a game, right? So that's pretty good. So it could kill lots of things. And then for whatever reason, it was changed. And now you can bomb every turn, and now you pick a spot, and all units within 6 inches on a 4-up take D3 mortal wounds. Characters or vehicles on a 5-up. And so probably if you can do that all 5 turns, you end up doing more mortal wounds to lots of different things. So probably it's better, but it just doesn't feel as good. And so you're still doing a 6-inch thing, and then you're rolling 4-up, and then you roll D3. So, I mean, you could get really good, but it kind of like orbital bombardment, and orbital bombardments have never been super good. Now, probably turn 1 is the best time too, also to hit as many people, because you got your buff character and everyone's within 6 of their buff character. And later in the game, it becomes very difficult to hit a lot of things. And even turn 1 is hard because you have to be able to fly over that spot, right? So it's hard to do. So I feel like the bombs probably took a nerf, but if you can keep it alive 5 turns, it probably does more mortals. It's also literally like the only source of mortal wounds in our entire faction. So, so if you really want to do some mortals, then you have to take one of these guys. Okay. So melee, there's no melee. I'm not even going to bother talking about melee. Defensively, though, they do have a 5-up invuln in melee as well, so they may be able to survive getting rocked by a flying melee monster. So that's at least a good thing to have that 5-up there. Okay, rules. So they both have hover. Hover obviously gives them a lot of flexibility to stay on the board if you don't want them to fly off. Also, it just turns them down to a minimum move of 20, and then they can, eat Overwatch and bad touch things, and they can do all these kind of crazy things as well. Unfortunately, they're still aircraft when they're in hover, so they still can't hold objectives, but as we already said, they're pretty good at covering objectives up. They have the usual aircraft rules. -1 to hit, obviously, is good. It's the reason why Triple Orion worked really well back then is because they got -2 to hit with the Vexilla, and thus became really hard to kill. But of course, it doesn't stack anymore. So, but the -1 is still good because you can go wherever you want and you get your -1. So, transport. So, the Orion is a transport. It can take 12 infantry of any kind. So, there's no restrictions. So you can take Terminators in there. You can take Jump Pack, Venatari. You can take any infantry, which is good. Like, 12 guys. That's like your whole army, basically. And 7 infantry and a Dread as the alternative. And the Dread is all the Dreadnoughts except for the Telemon. Now, it would be super cool if you could drop a Telemon in someone's face. That might be worth running an Orion for, if you could run like a big unit of Terminators and then drop Bertha right on the line. But unfortunately not. But dropping Achilles is still probably pretty good if you're running that. But yeah. The problem is, do we need it? We're paying $100 premium for the transport, basically, over the Ares. And do we need that? Do we need? I think an answer is no. We could do with transports, but not at 500 points. Not even at 300 points. Something for like the Coronas. It's like too much. And we're gotten better at covering space and putting the presence on the board, and not using as much deep strike. And so the last thing we want to do probably is stuff our whole army in one vehicle with like a Trajan next to it, and then that's it. Like, that's the complete opposite of what we want to be doing in 9th. So I feel like we don't need the Orion at all for its transport capacity. So why are we paying $100 more for it for less shooting? So yeah. Now, you're putting a small model count army into an even smaller space. So I just think you're just going to struggle more with the basic thing you want to do in 9th, which is try and take up as much space as you can. Okay. Those are the only rules. The Ares has no special rules in and of itself. Okay. Points. So the Orion is 500 points. I think that is too many. And basically, I think it should come down a little bit to be similar to Knights. 450, 475 would be fairer. Its cost has gone up and down over time, but I think 500 is too many. And it's tough because if you make these too cheap, then people will take a bunch of them. And I think it's really hard to balance this points cost for these large models in a small model count elite army. Maybe it's a bit easier to balance it when you have a whole army of them, but when you have to take into account other things, it becomes very difficult to achieve that internal balance. And then it goes back to my original point of, do we want these to be good? So, it is what it is. They can obviously incentivize people to spend $500 by being really cheap and making it really good, but I don't feel like that's good for our faction. So anyway, the Ares is only 450 points, which is more reasonable. I actually think the Ares is a pretty reasonable points cost. I just feel like the main gun could be better. And when we do the comparables next, it's hard to argue that the Ares should be a lot cheaper than 450. Because then we'd see a lot of them, which, as I already said, maybe we don't want. Okay, so comparables. So inevitably, before we do that, let's compare to some of our own units. So internal comparisons. And by this, I mean opportunity cost. So what are you giving up by taking an Ares or an Orion? So for now, we're just going to talk about the Ares, because I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that we don't need the Orion. So why would you spend extra points, extra money to bring an Orion when you could just bring an Ares? So let's just talk Ares for now. So internally, the comparison is not great for the Ares. So 450 points, that used to be 5 bikes, but now it's 5 and a bit bikes who bring 5 salvo guns and travel still pretty fast and have melee and are OBSEC. And so actually 5 bikes compares better than an Ares. It's 1.5, almost 2 Telemons who can do all those other things that Telemons can do, and maybe arguably that's harder to kill than an Ares, 2 Telemons. So, that's 5 of any other of our units, 5 or 6 Terminators, bikes, Guardians, Sags, Venatari, like It's just very expensive. And so you give up a whole unit of something else, at least a unit and a bit, to bring the Ares. And you're giving up all the rules and stratagems and other things that all those units can use that the Ares cannot use. And so you really have to consider what you're giving up if you decide to bring one of these guys, and what you want this thing to do, and if you think that it's the only thing that can do that for you, and if it's worth the points cost. The other comparison that's coming out now, especially if people have been starting to talk more about using Custodes tanks again in the Drukhari meta, is double Custodes. So 2 Custodes tanks is the cost of an Ares. And so would you rather have an Ares, or would you rather have 2 Custodes tanks? Let's say 2 Blaze Custodes. So you have double the number of Custodes Blaze shots. You don't have the big gun, which we've already decided may not be worth the extra money. You have mobility, not the flyer type of mobility, but you have 14-inch moving flying tanks. And you have range. And 2 Custodes tanks is probably just a little bit easier to kill than an Ares. You can hide them better. You can get the Vexilla on there. And, it's T7 instead of T8 and similar number of wounds. Same save. So probably you'd be better off taking 2 Custodes tanks than taking Ares. And then the Custodes, especially if you got the Blaze and the Lastrum, they give you a little bit of flexibility there. I think the Accelerator is going to be very good in like Drukhari meta. So, I think that actually 2 Custodes tanks compares better than 1 Ares. So again, if you're taking the Ares in our army, what are you giving up to take that Ares? Okay, so let's go through the inevitable comparison, which is the comparison of these flying knights to actual knights. So an actual knight is T8, 24, 26 wounds, depending on if it's the big dude. Usually 3-up save, no invuln, 4-up invuln, rotate 5-up invuln, rotate 4-up invuln, various types of shooting, Gatling shooting, all that sort of stuff. And they're all around 400 to 500 points, depending on which knight. And of course, so let's compare. So it's difficult to compare. We have a flyer and we have a knight. And so we have -1 to hit natively, and obviously our flyers hit at BS2, so that's good. But knights can fight, they can charge, and they have a whole codex of things to support them, relics, rules, stratagems, and they can hold objectives. So invariably, it's a tough comparison for our humble flyer here. And so it's really a trade-off. So, maybe not a fair comparison, but being in the same price bracket with the same defensive stats, you have to think. Guard super heavies, I think we compare well to guard super heavies. Guard super heavies are not in a good place right now. They're too expensive. They don't shoot that well. We move better. We shoot better. We're tougher, and we have enough guns. So I think we compare well with guard super heavies. How about Mortarion? Mortarion's 490 points. That's the same points as an Orion, give or take. A little bit more expensive than an Ares. Would you rather take Mortarion, or would you rather take an Orion or an Ares? I think I'd rather take Morty. I mean, he's got a shit ton of more rules. He flies and he kicks butt. So yeah. So that's an interesting comparison. Or Magnus. Magnus is 465. He probably does more mortal wounds with smites than we would do with bombs. Silent King is 450. Tesseract Vault is probably way overpriced at 500. And the Stompa, of course, is 900 points, which is hilarious. But it's interesting, when you get into these really big models, it becomes really hard to point them well in order to balance with the rest of their armies, which are small models. So except for Imperial Knights, like pure Knights, which, even now with the little armigers and stuff, becomes a little bit more difficult. But Knights are constantly going up and down in points because it's so hard to balance big polarizing models. Okay. Strats. Okay, so not a lot of strats that you would end up using on these guys. Probably the most common strat you would use on them is Grim Responsibility from Shadowkeepers. Obviously, as we already know, -1 strength on T8 is super good, and without that, you probably wouldn't run these guys at all. So being able to -1 strength on these guys is obviously essential to keeping them alive. Similarly, Emperor's Old Spice, use it to keep these guys alive. Emperor's Hand, I guess, is good if you're running emissaries and you have one of these guys, and you can avoid those painful -1s to hit or to wound. And Indomitable Engines, a very key strat on these guys to stop taking mortals on a 5-up Feel No Pain. So that's a super important one to remember. No other strats really matter for these guys. And they don't have the Machine Spirit thing anymore, so even that's not a thing. Okay, so how do you play them then if you're going to play it? So I guess you could run 3 of these, but as I said, I think that that's not good. And not good for your wallet either at $1,500. So let's just assume that you're just running one of these guys. So how can you run it? Well, I feel like you, as I already said, you have to design your list around this a little bit because you're losing a quarter of your army to this one model. You need to be able to have a plan for it, what you want it to do in all your different matchups, and what the rest of your army is going to do while this thing is flying around. And so it kind of determines your army design. And it would be interesting to run an army of all vehicles and dreads and no infantry, see how that goes. But what is the use of like an Ares? So let's see. In the current meta, if you can call it a meta, we have lots of vehicles. Specifically, we have armies with like 8, 9 raiders. 6 to 8, 9 raiders. And this thing will pop some raiders. So if you can use an Ares to pop like a couple of raiders a turn, I think that's putting you in a decent position. And so I think it's a consideration, but the question is, can you pop those raiders in a cheaper way? But, you know, you could use it as for what it's designed to do, which is vehicle hunting like that. And if we see AdMech come back, we're going to see, you know, maybe robots, chicken walkers, their annoying flyers, those little hover tank thingies. I mean, we're going to see a bunch of vehicles, so maybe we're going to start to look for more anti-vehicle shooting than we have, which the Ares does bring. So kind of meta considerations. Other meta considerations like shooting Terminator blocks with Transhuman, that does not feel good. This is really not the thing you want to be throwing into Terminator blocks. The auto Transhuman is going to make your 450 point salty tiers just more salty. Like, it just doesn't work. This thing might be good at killing other flyers. So I don't think we're going to see many Drukhari flyers from what I hear. But, AdMech's going to bring all their annoying flyers. This thing could hunt down flyers pretty easily. And because flyers generally not that hard to kill. So there's that. If the Caladius comes back into fashion, and especially double Caladius, then I don't think you're going to see the Ares at all. Because the double Caladius, as we already decided, is probably better. So, yeah. The other way you can use it is move blocking. So, you don't want to pay 450 points to move block. But if you got one, you can use it to move block. It should always be in the top of your mind in your movement phase. How can I use this? Because it can generally shoot whatever it wants from anywhere on the table. Well, how can I use this flyer to move block? Now, unless your infantry's army is completely infantry based, move blocking is still very much possible and not that hard to do. Just have to pre-measure what their movement is and then put your thing in an appropriate spot to block it. And they cannot stop on top of your base, so you can still very effectively move block things with your flyer and its base. So take that into account whenever you're playing with one of these guys. How can you screw up your opponent's movement phase by move blocking them? It can be particularly hard to deal with. I mean, people are kind of running a lot of anti-vehicle these days, but it still requires a bunch of anti-vehicle with -1 to hit, and T8 with -1 strength, and a 5-up invuln, 22 wounds. It's going to take quite a bit of punishment, and so it can be hard to deal with. And so if you can use it to take out your opponent's anti-vehicle shooting quickly or your other resources, then it becomes impossible to deal with, and then just moves, blocks, and shoots all game long and drops bombs all game. In which case it's probably pretty worth its 450 points if you get that confluence of situations. So there's that. It can help you score things like engage. Obviously, it still counts as a unit in a quarter, so it easily helps you get a quarter for engage. Also, maybe line breaker if that's part of your game plan. So it can definitely do that. And the ability to hover means it can stay in a spot if it needs to, so you don't lose that engage point. So it does help you with that. Okay. So overall, the Ares and the Orion. Oh yes, and obviously, as Mr. Funktastic mentioned, it's a where we stand, we fight target. So overall, I like our flyers, but I feel they could be more competitive for their points. Certainly, they are expensive models, and probably not worth it if you're having to, count your budgets. These are really extravagant buys, and so if you don't have one, don't go out and buy one. If you have one, have fun with it, but don't expect to win, 5-6 round major with one of these guys in your army. I think they're fun to use. I think they have their purposes. And I think in niche meta situations, you may find it very good. But just for all comers, kind of taking the best list you can, I don't feel like they fit into those lists. It'll be very interesting to see what GW does with these with our new books. There's a lot of people who don't feel like the Forge World sheets will change. Maybe they won't. But the points can definitely change. And there may be strats and things. Who knows? But I don't think the new book will be like super supporting the flyers. They obviously won't be core. And they're probably not going to have any specific strats for them or anything. So I just feel like they make it maybe a little bit cheaper, but I don't feel like there's going to be a lot of codex support for the flyers. So I don't think they're going to get any more competitive, but you never know. You never know. And so, if you have one, keep it on your shelf just in case. Play it in your games, and we'll see what happens to it. Anytime you throw a giant model into a list of non-giant models, you risk gatekeepering yourself and your opponent. You risk being a gatekeeper to your opponents, and you risk getting gatekeepered. And so I just don't think it's any different with our army to throw these big flyers in. And so generally, I don't think it's a great idea. But who can argue with a flying boomerang? It's pretty sweet. Okay. Let's go to questions. People have questions in the chat. Put it down. Go into Discord now. Where are we going? Here it is. Okay. Okay. Other thing the Ares is good at is against Satans, because you can drop some mortals on it. Sure. I mean, so again, that's super like niche meta consideration. Okay. There's just a bunch of conversation here. Let me just find the questions. Which flying stem do you use? So I think we talked about that. Now, I really can't remember which is the base that comes with it, but I believe that it's the big oval base. So you kind of have to use that, but it does come with the short hover stem, and so you are free to use that if you like. So there you go. Okay. Which looks cooler? The Ares definitely looks cooler. The Orion just looks like a flying milk carton with some wings on the side. I really don't like the look of the Orion. The Ares looks a lot cooler. Did they resolve the deployment zone issue? So we talked about that at the beginning. How do you justify an Ares in a take all comers list when there are matchups where there's no good targets to shoot at? Well, you can't. That's the conclusion we've come to. I'm too late, but I wanted to ask if the investment in a 4-draw flyer is worth it for the moment And I've answered that, and I say no. Okay, stream. What do you think of the new codexes they are releasing? I think they're good. I mean, every codex they release seems super powerful, and then it ends up either being or not being. And I think that's just part of the flux situation we're in right now with a new edition, new codexes, and a lot of us still using old codexes. We're doing still pretty good considering our codex is one of the oldest ones now. But I'm looking forward to our new codex, and if anything to go by, I think we'll be pretty good. So I think it's people shouldn't be down about the new codexes being strong, because eventually, hopefully, we'll also be strong, and then everybody will be even playing field. I think one of the biggest skew things right now is the faction-specific secondaries. And so the faction-specific secondaries are the real skew thing right now that are kind of ruining some people's games, because, auto-scoring secondaries is not good for the game, I don't think. So we'll have to see what happens when everybody's got theirs. But then if everybody has an auto score of 30 and is really just a game about getting the last 15 points, then that also becomes not fun. So I feel like eventually going to have to do something about those faction-specific secondaries to tune them down a little bit. I think GW is going to make a new flyer in the new codex. I don't know. Who knows? Nobody knows. I'm not sure why you would think that or not think that. It just is. There may be new models coming out if you've read the new Dan Abnett novel, Penitent. No spoilers. Just saying that is apparently canon. So no spoilers. Read the book. Penitent, Dan Abnett. There hasn't been a bad codex in 9 so far. No, they've all been pretty good, but you always see, like, the newer codexes is always the newer hotness. Who knows? There's also not even half as much people playing as there was in 8th edition right now because of COVID. So really, we don't know. We are getting our whole informed decision based on a very small amount of information compared to before. And you can't count Australia because they do weird things down there. So, okay. Well, that's it, guys. So, some announcements. First of all, next week on Thursday night, we have Tactica episode with none other than Ridvan, a.k.a. Archon Skari from Scarcast. One of probably the most well-known Dark Eldar or Drukhari player on the planet. And he is just enjoying life right now. With a supremely powerful codex, and he is definitely not someone you can accuse of bandwagoning on Drukhari. So he is going to join me next Thursday, and we're going to talk all about how good Drukhari are, what are their tricks, and how he feels that we may be able to beat them, or at least not get tabled so quickly. So he's going to come and tell us how to beat Drukhari next Thursday. And then the week after that, still waiting to be confirmed, but I hope to have on John Lennon from Art of War fame, of course. And he is going to join me and do the much requested show on soup. Yes, we will be talking about soup with John. He's been running a soup list very successfully on his channel. And we will be talking about soup options for Custodes and what he feels are some of the good ones and bad ones to entertain. And so that will be hopefully the week after next. And another special announcement, we've had so many good comments from all sorts of people about our interview that we did last week with Steve Joll from 40K Game Changers. And certainly Steve is a really awesome guy to have on, and I'm really gutted that I missed that conversation, but I totally enjoyed listening to it afterwards, and Nick and Francois still talking about it. And so we have decided to join forces, and so Steve will be joining us on a regular, either monthly or every 2 months. We'll be doing a show. We haven't decided what to call it yet. Maybe something like Conversations with Steve or Conversations from the Other Side, something like that, where we're just going to talk about things, shoot the shit, catch up on hobby, because it's just so fun talking to Steve. So hopefully that will be announced soon, and so stay tuned for those shows. And that's it. So Thank you very much for watching, supporting, following, subscribing, being patron, joining the Discord. Thank you very much for contributing, everybody, and we'll see you guys next time.